I don't think it would be a stretch to say that pretty much everyone suffers from some form of anxiety, and morbid anxiety has become extremely common in our modern era, perhaps more so than ever before, since in a lot of ways we have nothing but time on our hands. And because of that, anxiety and overthinking, and also sometimes invasive thoughts, tend to go hand in hand. These subjects of invasive thoughts, anxiety, all that sort of stuff, it's extremely relevant to creative types, myself included, and a lot of the people I interact with in person, online, etc., are all also creative types. So this is something that I've had a lot of experience with personally, but just also seeing it around me. There are lots of reasons for this, and they're all sort of interconnected, but I would actually define the reason, all of these interconnected reasons in fact, under one sort of umbrella. And that's simply that highly creative people tend to be highly imaginative. And imagination is extremely correlative with high degrees of sensitivity and high degrees of empathy. And when these things all come together, all of these qualities can cause anxiety for different reasons. Imagination is sort of a function of all these things. For example, empathy. We tend to have higher empathy when we are better at imagining ourselves in other positions. The more imagination and creativity a person has, the more productive the mind is at all times, trying to project itself into different scenarios or the thoughts of different people, different experiences, that kind of thing. Sensitivity is a component of that. If you think of imagination as sort of like a device that takes in input and analyzes it and reframes it, which is what I think imagination essentially is, people with higher sensitivity are always going to be taking in more data. They're going to be sort of regurgitating it inwardly and outwardly. Very anxious people are usually in a much more aware state of mind. They're looking around, they're taking in all the details they can for whatever reason. The reason that a person becomes sensitive to details can vary drastically. It can be just something we're born with, or it can be something we've developed over time. It's something we can train ourselves to do. It's something that can kick in because of negative experiences. So, for example, a lot of anxious people are in a state of vigilance. Some part of them is attempting to take in more information in order to protect itself from surprises or from any kind of known fear that's been present in the past. Imagination, in my opinion, is basically the most powerful part of a person's mind. And when you have an excessively good imagination, this is, of course, a double-edged sword. It's both a tool and a weapon, and I'm actually going to be getting back to that a little bit later in the video. But suffice it to say that imagination is an extremely powerful part of a person. One of the most common symptoms of anxiety is what we would call invasive thoughts. I would personally say that a lot of the thought patterns we have when we're anxious could be classified as invasive thoughts, even though in a lot of cases they're more subtle. In my opinion, there are three main types of invasive thoughts, and I would categorize these as what I would call nightmare thoughts, superstitious thoughts, and guilty thoughts. The first one, the nightmare scenarios, is about catastrophizing. It's about what-if questions. It's about thoughts of random things basically happening, or things that we can't really control that might just visit upon us. The second type, the superstitious thoughts, is more about associations, things like horror and things like automatic triggers. So it's more about, we think about Y and then we think about Z automatically. Things that we don't really want in the mind that just kind of keep popping up, even though they're not things we're afraid will happen necessarily. They're just things that trouble us throughout the night, maybe for no apparent reason. And then the third category, the guilty thoughts, is more like almost a form of self-punishment. Like we think about things that upset us, or imagining things that we feel guilty immediately afterwards for imagining. What all of these thoughts have in common is that they tend to conceal an effort to control and identify unseen things and things that are beyond our control. And they do this in different ways. So, for example, the first type, the catastrophizing or thinking about random what-ifs, is more about having vigilance towards the external. So it's about foreseeing outcomes and being prepared for them. The more creative the person is, the more easy it is for them to imagine different contingencies and different combinations of events, and therefore to become frightened of those and to imagine the ways in which they would respond. Now, of course, this is in some ways a healthy thing to do. It's very important to have an inventive mind. It's very important to be able to imagine scenarios and solutions, but obviously when it's an invasive thought, it's when this sort of thing is running rampant, when this sort of thing is interrupting the day in a way that's not productive. The second type I would almost describe as a form of bargaining for control. It's almost like we're ritualizing our anxiety, and this somehow gives us the illusion of peace and control. The third one is often our mind's way of trying to get us to engage with things that are in the unconscious, and these could be fears or beliefs or even, again, associations that we don't know how to handle. Of course, most of these invasive thoughts involve things that we fear and things that we hate. That's sort of a common thread running throughout. As many of you already know, giving something hate and fear often gives that thing power. And of course the only real way to neutralize it is to bear indifference towards it. But I'll be getting back to that in a little bit. So what can we actually do about it? This is where being creative actually comes into it. Because being creative is at least partly what gets us into these kinds of situations. They happen to everyone, but they happen more to sensitive people. And sensitive people, of course, are the most likely to be overwhelmed by them. This is very much going to be about turning that weapon into a tool. The instinct is to try to defeat this kind of thing with logic. But the reality, of course, is that logic just simply isn't enough. This is a different kind of arena. Imagined problems pretty much exclusively are solved with imagined solutions. I know I kind of say this a lot, but a change of perspective is probably the most powerful thing we can do for ourselves. So I'm going to give an example. A lot of adults are frightened of creatures from horror movies and horror video games. It's kind of a staggering amount. Things that we've seen in childhood still continue to haunt us. Many of us logically know that these creatures don't exist, but they still hold a lot of power over us. So here's an example of how a perspective change comes into play. We know for a fact that the creatures from the movie or the game don't exist. They will never exist. That's what we tell ourselves, and we don't really feel any better about it if we're scared of this thing. So this is another route that we can take. Instead, tell yourself that this thing does exist. So tell yourself, okay, that thing is real. That thing can get me. In fact, every single time I think about that thing and feel upset by it, that thing has got me. That's what that thing can do to me, and it does it repeatedly. The instinct is to run away from it, to quarantine it. And obviously we can't. When it's in your imagination, you can't run anywhere. It's the one thing that we can never really get away from. All we can do is recontextualize it. And that means, rather than contracting this thing's existence, the most productive thing we can do is expand it. Expand the context of this thing that upsets us. If horror creatures exist, which they do, off in their own little realm of imagination, which many of us understand, is not really any less real than the physical reality. It affects us very strongly all throughout the day, often in a way that's more potent and relevant than what we consider real. Therefore, so must everything else, right? Right next to that clown and that zombie and that demon and whatever else is lurking up there is Superman, Santa Claus. I'm actually still frightened of a couple horror creatures that I saw in my childhood, And for a big chunk of my life, I would think about these things every single time I went to bed. What I started to do was to imagine counterbalances to it. Okay, yeah, that thing is real. That thing can get me. But we also have to remember that we created it. We took input that we were given, maybe input we shouldn't have been given, but we created that entire machine within the mind that feeds us this information and causes us to react. So we can create a new machine or expand upon the existing machine by adding any number of things from our imagination, from the same source. We can imagine a protector entity, for example. We can imagine, I don't know, a hero from a video game that we like, or a comic book hero or something like that. Spider-Man is going to go into your mind and distract the evil clown, or waylay the evil clown in some way. If my own mind is able to conjure up something evil and frightening, then surely it's also able to protect me. This same approach can be taken with unpleasant emotions or any other forbidden thoughts. And that leads me to my next point. There's no such thing as a thought crime. This is your space, and there's no real consequence for having a bad thought. The only punishments we receive for having a bad thought are the ones that we give to ourselves. In fact, there really is no such thing as a bad thought. This is a sacred space. The mind is a sacred space. The imagination is your own container. It doesn't exist for anyone but you. And anything that goes on in there is allowed. There's no portion of the mind that is truly forbidden. The only way that we are entering forbidden space is if we tell ourselves that this space is forbidden, and we construct all these kinds of rules around it. And this kind of leads me to the next point I wanted to touch on: the positive reason behind the negative thought. We, as a culture, are often actively looking for the negative aspects to positive things. We are a society of critics. We're a society that stigmatizes absolutely everything. We are obsessed with improvement. We are obsessed with things being tarnished, tainted. Every other story is about falling from grace. Every other story is about how did this good person become this gritty, badass detective. Or everything we look at is always through this lens of slow decay. And it makes sense. I mean, we live in a universe that's increasing in entropy. And sure, but well, that's only one way to look at things. It's just a very small piece of a much bigger picture. We are a very frightened, heavy-handed, superstitious lot overall. So it's important to remember that this kind of judgment is inflicted upon the inner world just as often as the outer world, if not more. Many of the people watching this have almost certainly heard of the concept of the shadow. I'm not really here to talk about what that is. There's a lot of information about that out there already. I'm more interested in talking about what to actually do about it. Dealing with the shadow is very much about bringing light into darkness. And bringing light into darkness in this context is actually about finding the light that's already there. Generally speaking, all feelings, all thoughts, all personality traits have a negative aspect and a positive aspect. And you can't really have one without the other. You may have heard the expression before that a negative thought is concealing a positive wish. Or more likely the inverse of that, which again we are obsessed with, that every positive thing we do or say is concealing some selfish motive. It's like, yes, they're both true. But that doesn't diminish the virtue of the positive aspect. So to give some examples, an overly angry person might be trying to protect themselves or a loved one. The anger can be a manifestation of an unmet need. For example, maybe they need more space, maybe they feel like they're not really getting heard. The anger is a response, it is a symptom to a positive wish that's buried or not really being addressed. Another example is jealousy. A jealous person might have some sort of malice or frustration or sorrow that they hold towards another person or other people, but that is concealing a positive wish to be recognized, to get attention. Anxiety, likewise, usually corresponds with one kind of unmet need or another. The process of dealing with rampant imagination can be described in 3 basic steps. Firstly, we have to allow the thoughts to exist. Secondly, we have to match the anxious thought with an appropriate response. So, to give an example, one of the most common invasive thoughts I've had to deal with in my lifetime is an image where I open a cupboard and all the contents of the cupboard suddenly fall down upon me. So all these objects are suddenly falling on me and I'm not able to catch them or stop them from breaking. One of the things that really helped me to deal with it and other things like this is to, again, do the first step, acknowledge it, like let myself have the thought instead of running away from it, and then after that, just kind of matching it with the energy it deserves. So it doesn't deserve a catastrophic response, but it doesn't deserve no response either. So I would think about that and then I would tell myself, oh man, that would suck, because that, at the end of the day, if it did happen, it would just be life. Life would move on. I'd have to buy new plates or cups or whatever, and I wouldn't like it. It would be upsetting. It doesn't deserve my fear. Same thing with other thoughts of things just randomly going wrong. I just think to myself, oh man, that would suck. Oh, I sure hope that doesn't happen. And I found that was very helpful to just recognize, yeah, that would be really crappy, rather than pretending that I didn't have the thought. And I found myself able to laugh at myself a little bit more, and also able to move on from it a little bit more. This kind of blends in with the 3rd step, which is don't punish yourself for having the thought. The worst part of invasive thoughts is often the kind of secondary invasive thought that comes with it, this kind of denial. You've already had the thought. You can't undo it. You can't say, oh no, that doesn't count. I'm not like that. That's not inside me. It is inside you. And it's better to just let yourself have it and recognize that this doesn't affect anyone but you. It's yours. This is your mind. You own that thought. It doesn't own you. You're allowed to have it if you want to, and it doesn't mean anything. We may have some associations connected with these invasive thoughts, but we get to choose how significant or insignificant they are. Our instinct to recoil from the thoughts that upset us are sort of the worst of both worlds, because we're pretending that they're not real. We're letting them exist in the shadow, in the corner, pretty much permanently, and they are affecting us. Denial towards these things is actually not very helpful in any context. So that brings me to the kind of final unofficial step, which comprises the other 3. This last step is about learning to enjoy the thoughts. That might seem counterintuitive at first, but hear me out. If you think of the mind as sort of like a holodeck or a book or an empty stage, think of it as some video game engine or some thing that just renders. We can therefore come to understand the objects within that space as being impermanent renderings. I like to think of the negative thoughts and negative characters and associations within my mind as being kind of like weird little goblins and weird little, the zingers from Donkey Kong, those bees that hang out. Like, that's how I think of these things. They're just almost like flora and fauna of the mind. So, some of these things will naturally sting you if you get too close to them. I like to think of the mind as sort of an ecosystem, and everything within it has a purpose, has naturally evolved from everything else around it, and everything within the mind is worthy of study, worthy of examination. I've personally discovered that it's possible to sort of cultivate an affection for these things. If we characterize them as animals or plants or weather conditions within the mind, just things that are naturally present, things that have emerged because of the combinations of events around them. We can learn to regard these things with a little bit more indifference. We can take a step back and put these things into their proper contexts. We can't erase things from this ecosystem, but we can expand the context around it. We can influence the rest of the ecosystem. We can subtly manipulate our own thoughts, our own associations, our own perspectives in a way that can effectively neutralize these demons and wild beasts that roam around in the imagination. And another benefit of imagining it this way is that we can interact with it a little bit better. Give it a character, give it a face, give it a personality. If you have an invasive thought that keeps coming, or you have a fear or memory that keeps coming, or anything like that, we can actually interact with these things. We can expose them to compassion. We can expose them to the light. We can shine a light into the darkness. Look at these things head on. Ask them, why are you here? What do you need? What are you afraid of? And this doesn't take any more imagination than it actually took to have the thought in the first place, because it's your realm, it's your space. So again, this is where the 3 steps apply. Acknowledge the thought, own it. You've had the thought. It's already done its damage. It's already happened. There's nothing to run away from. You're literally already in it. Second step, put the thought into its proper context. Zoom out. You're probably way too zoomed in on this thought right now. Zoom out. Think about all the other things going on in your mind right now, all the other contexts surrounding this, because they are no less relevant. Once it's in its proper context, you can interact with it. And that leads to the 3rd step. Don't beat yourself up about it. You don't have to feel guilty for having the thought. You don't have to punish yourself for having the thought. Maybe a better way of rephrasing the 3rd step is ennoble it. So acknowledge it, contextualize it, embrace it. It's not this horrible thing that you're trying to get away from. Not really. It's a part of you. It's a reaction within your mind. Ennoble it by acknowledging the positive wish hidden within it, acknowledging the reason for its existence. And if you want to, just kind of reskin it. Reskin it as a weird little wolf or goblin or creature that lives inside, and maybe even try to regard it with a little bit of affection, because it's really just a piece of you. It's a kind of lost childlike piece of the self that just wants the right to exist. It just wants the right to be seen within its proper context and not be quarantined off to the side. It's not really possible to stop or erase the thought. And as long as we take that approach, we will continue to be plagued by the same cyclical intrusions in our lives. However, it is possible to change how we feel about the thought, how we respond to it, and how it affects us. It's not the invasive thought that hurts. It's how we react to it that hurts. The stress that we feel about these things is caused by the internal, unspoken relationships that we've formed inside of our minds. Examining these relationships, characterizing them, and coming to regard them with maybe a little bit more compassion, maybe a little bit more affection, is ultimately going to bring about the state of peace that we're trying to reach by pushing these thoughts away.